Jacques Gallant, how are you?
Hi, I'm good. How are you?
I'm fine, thank you. It's nice to see you again. This
Yeah,
is
you
not your
too.
it's not your first time on this show, but it's always a pleasure to chat with you and to catch up. And today, actually, you're going to be doing a full reporting job because you're going to be reporting to us on some of the interesting cases that have been going on in Toronto mainly, and that you've been covering. And you're going to give us some information about some interesting and upcoming cases. So I'm excited to hear what you have to say about all that. I'll let you do all the talk,
Well,
Jacques.
thanks for having me again. Happy to talk about what's happening lately and coming up. I would say like lately, what we're still seeing in the court in Toronto, and we'll still be seeing for a couple more weeks, is there's been a number of cases from high-profile random attacks on members of the public in the TTC back in 2022 and 2023. There was like a whole string of them that really, I think, sparked fear in commuters. It led Toronto police to announce a temporary increase of officers on the transit system back in 2023. And so now what we're seeing is all of these cases at last kind of coming to a conclusion just recently in the system. And so this week alone, well, actually, just this morning, for example, I was at a sentencing for Jordan O'Brien Tobin, who pleaded guilty to second-degree murder for randomly stabbing a 16-year-old boy to death at Keele Station in March 2023. He was sentenced to the automatic sentence of life, of course, in prison, but with no chance of parole for 18 years. And this past Monday, and this is the case that's going to be ongoing, there was a guilty plea to first-degree murder from Nengjia Jin, who's the man who stabbed a woman to death, another random attack at High Park Station in December 2022. And so he pleaded guilty to first-degree murder, obviously, again, automatic life sentence. And that should be coming up again in court in March for further materials to be entered on the guilty plea. And then finally, likely sometime in April, they haven't set a date yet for that sentencing and for for the victim's family to be able to provide victim impact statements. So those are some of the big high profile cases that have been happening lately at court in Toronto that I'll be keeping an eye on for the foreseeable future. And then in terms of like what's coming up, both in Toronto and elsewhere, I think in the immediate future, there's going to be the sexual assault trial for five hockey players, four of whom are in the NHL in London, Ontario. That starts April 22nd with jury selection, and it's currently for 8 weeks. But as you know, I'm sure like trials never. I don't know, sometimes they can go much longer than that, or they can be much shorter than that. And I kind of get the impression it's not going to be the full 8 weeks, but I guess you never really know. And that, of course, is the five players who have been charged with sexually assaulting a woman in 2018 in a hotel in London. And so she'll, of course, be testifying, and we'll have to see if all the five players or some of them will also testify in their own defense. But that will be a very high profile case. There'll be a lot of media attention on that because it also just raises a lot of questions about the treatment of like cracking down on allegations of sexual assault in professional sports, making it a safe environment for everyone. These players are in the NHL. They're all very well known, and so it will attract a lot of attention. I think we'll see even more journalists than usual that you would normally see at a court case cover this particular trial. And another one that'll be happening right around the same time, but at the end of March, is the trial in Cayuga for Randall McKenzie. And he's the man who's accused of murder for shooting an OPP officer, Greg Prashala, a few years ago. And that was a very high profile case as well, because that's the case that sparked all of this political discourse about bail and whether there needs to be more stringent measures, whether more people should be denied bail, because it was reported at the time that Mr. McKenzie had been out on bail. And in fact, there was a warrant out for his arrest at the time when he was arrested in that shooting. And so that starts at the end of March for a jury trial as well for a few weeks. And I would imagine there'll be a lot of attention placed on that case as well. And then a bit further down the year in October in Toronto, we're expecting the trial for Richard Edwin. That is another case of a random fatal attack on TTC property. It's the last one that I can think of from that 2022-2023 era when we were seeing a number of random attacks in or around TTC property. This is a man who is accused of fatally shooting two men at random, one of whom was a 21-year-old international student outside of Sherburne Station. And so this happened in April 2022. And so it's already been a while. And I know I'm personally curious to just see what happened here. Like it's such a chilling case, just the allegations alone. And so I'll be very curious to see the outcome in that case. And so the trial is currently set for October of this year in Toronto. And then finally, the last one that I can think of that will certainly be on a lot of people's radar is the trial of Kenneth Law in Newmarket, currently scheduled for January of next year. And he's the man who's facing multiple murder charges in a case where he's accused of helping to send a product to individuals to help them commit suicide. And so he's facing numerous murder charges, and we'll have to see if the Crown does decide to actually proceed to trial on those murder charges. It sounds like a very novel case to me and very interesting to follow as well. And so that'll be in Newmarket in January, and I would imagine there will be a lot of attention on that case at that time as well.
Yeah, very interesting. And a lot of violence, though, so
Yes.
which is a little bit scary. Going back to these random attacks, though, because you've been covering quite a few of these cases, Jacques. Has there been some kind of explanation as to why these are happening? Because these are unrelated incidents, right? Like they're just the individuals. It's not like it's an organized crime that's doing that. People who are
Mhm.
working together and are attacking randomly other
Mhm.
people. So has there been something that transpired from these cases as to an explanation as to why these random attacks have been happening?
Well, that's the frustrating part, I suppose, is that you don't get a lot of explanation sometimes in a lot of these cases. They are so senseless at the end of the day. I can tell you, for example, in the case of the man who pleaded guilty on Monday in the High Park Station stabbing, he's been found fit to stand. He was found fit to stand trial, and so he pleaded guilty to first-degree murder. And he did say in court on Monday when he entered that plea that he was out looking for revenge that day and wanted to kill because he had allegedly been blinded by a doctor and had gone to see a lawyer to sue the doctor. And he claims that the lawyer said to him that he couldn't sue because he had no legal status in Canada. He did enter Canada illegally. And so he was out looking for revenge, is the word he used in court on Monday, and chose, unfortunately, this 31-year-old woman he didn't know at High Park Station. And so that's the explanation. It's extremely senseless and tragic. And at the very least, though, pleading guilty scraps a 5-week trial, and the victim's family won't have to go through that at the very least. But it is nonetheless tragic and senseless. And then in today's case, the sentencing for the man
Yeah.
who randomly stabbed a 16-year-old boy at Kiel Station. No explanation whatsoever. He did get up in court at his sentencing hearing and apologized. He's very sorry for his actions, but no explanation other than the day it happened. He did text some friends and family just before the killing saying someone's dying tonight. And then after he did it, he said, I just stabbed someone random, and then was arrested a few hours later. And no formal diagnosis of a major mental illness, but a forensic psychiatrist did have the opinion that he is probably psychopathic, is the exact quote from the psychiatrist's report, probably psychopathic, and has over 100 convictions in the criminal justice system, mainly for not following court orders. So today, Justice Kelly, in sentencing him, said, his criminal record and his history alone just show that he's unmanageable in the community. He continues to present a danger to society. And she even said that sentence of life in prison is not only mandatory in this case, it is manifestly fit and appropriate.
Right. So this is someone who does have a history, though, with the criminal justice system,
Yes.
although it may not be as serious. Like it doesn't seem like it was necessarily violent convictions. It was mostly,
Well, there were a few convictions, mainly for failing to abide by court
yeah.
orders, but there were a few convictions over the years that involved violence, a few assault convictions, sometimes with a weapon. And actually, just 2 weeks before the stabbing at Kiel Station, he had been granted probation for a sexual assault that he actually committed on the subway 2 years earlier.
Okay. I mean, just hearing these cases, Jacques, it's a little bit bizarre because I mean, we have to put this into context. This is Canada. Like we don't use like these are crazy stories that we usually hear in the US. But in Canada, I mean, we do have, it's not like we don't have crazy stories like that, but it just feels like we're getting a bit more of them is like this is also as similar to these cases are also the ones with the teenagers who were
Yes.
also attacking random homeless people, which were
Mhm.
also very frightening. So
Yeah.
I'm not sure where they are right now because there were quite a few of these cases as well in Toronto.
Yes, well yes, and that one they've announced. So there was the case of the 8 girls who were charged with in the death of a man who was homeless in Toronto, and so four of them, 4 or 5 of them have resulted in guilty pleas. One, her murder trial, judge alone murder trial, should be wrapping up in March. It's not sitting at the moment. I believe they're coming back in March to finish. And then the other remaining two, at least for now, have a jury trial scheduled for May.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
so that also is a little bit unusual um, in the sense that we're seeing also more violence with
Mhm.
youth offenders, more weapons and more serious violent crimes, which I mean, you're more aware of what's going on because you see all the court cases. So what is your
Mhm.
impression though? Do you have this feeling that there's more violence in young?
Um, I think the thing is that because it takes so long for a case to make its way through the courts, what we're seeing now are mainly incidents that happened between like 2021 to 2023. And I just feel like perhaps the height of the pandemic might have had an impact on that. I can't really put my finger on it, but I would assume that maybe the pandemic had some kind of impact on people's mental well-being and not being able to access supports that they might have otherwise been able to access at another time. And so it's hard for me to say really if there remains a problem now because what we're seeing is from 2 to 3 years ago. Maybe ask me again in like 2 to 3 years when we're dealing with people who have been arrested now. I don't know. We'll have to see.
So this is though like kind of the direct outcome of the pandemic. Like that's we're kind of now seeing the cases that started around or right after the
Yeah.
pandemic, and that's
Yeah.
what's going on. So there was a lot of violence, and I mean, it was a time where people were feeling very isolated as well.
Mhm. Yeah,
So
absolutely. Yeah. And so we'll have to see if that trend continues for another in 2 years or if it finally improves. We'll have to see.
and what about these motor vehicle thefts? Because these are also, there are a lot of these cases going on, especially in the East region, I know, but I think in Toronto as well. Do you guys not have some of these cases?
Yeah, it's interesting that you bring it up because I did a piece actually like a month ago about um a judge in Toronto and a judge in Milton were both very frustrated with the joint submissions that were being put to them in auto theft in two
Yeah.
separate auto theft cases. And so I did a piece on that where in the Milton case, it was a case of the woman had pleaded guilty to attempting to steal a car from a driveway, and there was a joint position for suspended sentence. But then Justice Latimer had the parties come back and eventually gave her a conditional sentence. And then in the other case in Toronto, which I believe is still ongoing, Justice Brown of the OCJ had found again that the joint submission was too lenient. And in both cases, the judges had said, we know that this is a problem and an ongoing problem just by virtue of being citizens who live in these communities. And so I just found it was very interesting that you had judges putting both Crowns and defense lawyers on notice that like if you're going to come to it with us with a joint position in an auto theft case, it needs to be pretty kind of tough. But I just, at the same time, it's like if judges are going to make a habit of not accepting joint positions, that's a big problem for the system too, because why would anyone want to plead guilty?
Right, and resolve cases because
Exactly.
the other problem that we have is the backlog
Exactly.
in the
Yeah.
system. So it
But
is
it did communicate the frustration that some judges are feeling with the ongoing epidemic, as they both called it actually in their judgments, the epidemic of auto theft in Ontario.
But so I'm just curious to know what your point of view is on these cases because um, I know that the way the system is responding to them is by harsher punishments. Like they're now being, and as you've mentioned, even judges are not very happy when the joint position is too lenient from their perspective. So um, the concern here, though, is first of all, at the end of the day, it's not a violent offense, it's a motor vehicle theft. And many of these cases, uh, the offenders are very young and
Mhm.
sometimes youth, and they're clearly being manipulated and taken advantage of by some older adults who pay them money to do things that they are not mature enough to understand is just stupid. So I guess what I'm trying to ask here is, are we just addressing these cases in the proper way, do you think? Like, isn't there another underlying problem that should be addressed as opposed to just being harsher with them and punishing them with jail sentences?
I mean, I would think so, yes, because at the end of the day, this is just reactive. It's not, and you could say that about pretty much any offense, because we also have a continuing problem with gun violence in
Yeah.
Toronto, for example, and it's just like using prison or jail as the kind of one solution. I don't see how that I don't see how that addresses the bigger problem of, well, how do we prevent this from happening to begin with?
Right.
All you've done is punish one person because I know we're talking about car theft, but in a gun violence case I did recently where a judge was sentencing someone for a drive-by shooting in which no one there were no deaths but there were several injuries, so he was and he pleaded guilty to aggravated assault. The judge even said to him, you know, I doubt that a guy your age in Scarborough today is going to open up the paper to see what are the sentences these days for gun violence and then think about whether or not he wants to then go commit a
Right.
gun crime. Like I just the issue of the issue of deterring people through sentencing, it's a laudable goal, but I just don't I don't see it being very effective in almost any crime. Impaired driving, gun violence, auto theft, sexual assault. I just don't think I just don't think people who are committing these things know what's wrong. I just don't think I just don't think they're stopping to think. I wonder what the sentencing range is these days for impaired driving before getting behind the wheel drunk. So it's just like I do think we need to do a much better job at examining what leads to this epidemic in auto theft, for example, and sending people to prison. Like, I'm not saying don't do that, but that's not going to help answer that question as to why this is happening to begin with and what can we actually do to stop it.
And that's the thing. I mean, there are some people who, I mean, prison is also addresses the issue of separation, that you really need to separate those who are dangerous from society. And there are some who are dangerous. We're not trying to say that nobody here is dangerous. Some of them are, especially. the guy that you mentioned who did have a record of violence and non-compliance.
Mhm.
So obviously, I mean, in some situations, it's difficult to argue why prison wouldn't be an appropriate or fit sentence.
Mhm.
In many of these cases, it's a one-off, or there are circumstances that explain that. And as you mentioned, we're looking here at these cases that came right out of COVID, but COVID was a very unusual time. I mean, I
Mhm.
don't think anybody has experienced a time in their um, lives where almost the entire planet was had to stay home and
Yeah.
nobody was allowed to go home. So that is a pretty extreme experience, and it must have had a lot of impact on people in various ways. And one of them, sadly, is this reactive criminal, maybe a response. So, I mean, there has to be some kind of other ways to address these issues. And were you able to see in these cases some alternatives? Like, were there some cases where something else was suggested as opposed to just jail?
Unfortunately, I mean, in court, unfortunately, no, it's always jail,
Yeah.
And like, I think there should be a bigger conversation about alternatives in the justice system because of course it shouldn't apply to everyone who is convicted of a crime, for example. Yes, some people should be sent to prison, but I'm thinking of sexual assault cases, for example, where um, there is a push by some complainants in sexual assault cases, and I know this because I've interviewed some of them and done a piece on this, who want the case sent to restorative justice, for example, because it's less re-traumatizing for them. They feel like they can be properly heard and they feel like it can actually lead the offender to show real accountability. But the Ministry of the Attorney General prohibits the use of restorative justice in sexual assault cases because they say they're too serious to be sent to restorative justice. And yet, you have complainants, some complainants, not all of them, but you have some complainants in sexual assault cases saying they really want this. And then when they're told, no, it's not going to happen, we're proceeding with a criminal trial. You are going to have to testify. They say, okay, I'm not going to testify then. And then there's no case, then the charge gets withdrawn and then nothing has happened. Like there was no alternative was explored, nothing was done. And so how does that help anyone?
So, and you're touching here on something that I find is really frustrating in the criminal law world right
Mhm.
now is, and we see this, as you mentioned, in sex assault cases, but also very much in domestic violence cases
Mhm.
where the complainants do not want to proceed, or sometimes it's because they've exaggerated in the complaints, especially in the domestic violence cases. It was in a
Mhm.
moment of anger when there was an argument at home. They call the police just because they want the situation to end and they just exaggerate the facts, but it's not as bad as they report, and they no longer want to proceed. But then it's the Crowns who insist on proceeding. And that's here what I find is a little bit the frustration, because on top of that, we also, as we mentioned earlier, we have a backlog, right? We have a
Yeah.
lot. It's not like I don't think there's any courthouse that is sitting there in Ontario and has nothing to do and is just waiting for cases. I think we're all overwhelmed with work and with
Mhm.
cases. And it's this frustration of Crowns making the decision on behalf of the complainants that
Mhm.
no, we think, but it's, I mean, to what extent is it fair for them to make decisions on the part of individuals, like especially in domestic violence, because these are families, and sometimes a criminal case can break the family.
Yeah.
And aren't we supposed to help them get together, especially if there are children involved? And so sometimes when you have these decisions of no, it has to proceed, well, we're breaking the family at the same time. So, I mean, what are your thoughts about that?
I mean, I think I will say that I know crowns have to walk a delicate balance when it comes to that, because of course you do have complainants who will say, I don't want to go forward with this, but it's really just because, but it's because they're really fearful of the accused. And so you also want to ensure that they're also still somehow protected, but you're not getting that clear message from them. So I get that it's a delicate balance, but then I mean, I really don't know. I just think I do think the ministry should listen more to complainants in sexual assault cases and in intimate partner violence cases. At the very least, hearing what they want to say. and just having other options available. At the very least, like discussing having other options that can then be discussed with the complainant and then seeing if there's a path forward that way that, for example, in an IPV case that would hopefully not lead to ruptures and problems, other related problems in the family. Um, the thing is that like it's just right now, again, in sexual assault cases, that's kind of the only option is to push forward with the criminal matter. And I just don't know. I just think people might not realize enough just how devastating and re-traumatizing it can be for a complainant to be grilled on the stand in a sexual assault case, which is why some of them would much prefer another alternative that is far less re-traumatizing, like restorative justice.
Well,
But no.
it's the trauma and the embarrassment as well,
Mhm.
having to talk about all these details
Yeah,
in
in an open courtroom, yeah.
I mean, that is very, it's embarrassing for both, even for the accused, because I mean, the accused was also in that situation. So even though he's alleged to have done something criminal, but still, it's a very intimate situation, and it's not something that people would like to say in the open.
No.
So, any other, well, it doesn't seem like you've been covering a lot of sex assault cases these days. It was mainly these attacks and
And a few IPV murder trials that have all just now concluded though. But yeah, it was a very busy year at the beginning at 361 in Toronto with it was just one after the other, very tragic cases of men killing their partners. And so those have all wrapped up now, but just very, very devastating, very tragic. And one of them, actually, the sentencing was just today, but he was found guilty of first-degree murder for killing his ex-girlfriend. And what was especially awful in that case is that 3 days before she was killed, she reported his threats to Toronto police, and it was captured. And the whole interaction with police is captured on police body camera footage, where she says she doesn't want to go ahead with charge, like she doesn't want to see him charged because she says I don't want to see another black man put in jail, but I just want to feel safe. I just like she keeps saying I just want to feel safe, and the police are fairly dismissive of her and saying it looks like a he said, she said. That's an exact quote that they tell her, that it looks like she's instigating it as well. And what the jury didn't know is that those two officers faced discipline charges as a result of that interaction. So unfortunately, that's a theme I've seen in these IPV trials lately that have all just concluded at Superior Court in Toronto. Is there was an element of police being made aware of issues by the victims when they were still alive, and it didn't actually lead to nothing really happened because in the end their partners murdered them.
well, and that's another issue because there are times where the police will lay charges and the case is not really that serious, and you wonder why this is in the system. And in some
Mhm.
cases where they should act and do something,
Mhm.
nothing happens. So it's a little bit.
I know, I know. Well, and another one I was doing recently, was a man who's convicted of murder for killing his ex-wife and their daughter, their 20-year-old daughter, a couple of years ago. He just got convicted recently. Um, his ex-wife had reported him to York police, and they actually did get an arrest warrant, for him for uttering threats, but no evidence that he was ever even made aware of the warrant. No indication that they ever really enforced it. The detective who had interviewed the ex-wife about the threats came to testify and said, "Well, I was under the impression that the accused didn't have a phone at that time. I didn't know how to reach him." And she was asked, well, he was still communicating with his ex-wife at the time over Facebook. Couldn't you have at least tried to get in touch with him through Facebook? And she said, I was not afforded a work Facebook account. And it kind of just left it like that. Like there was just no indication that any
Real
significant work
effort.
was done to
Yeah.
enforce that warrant. And
Yeah.
then sadly, 2 years later, he killed his ex-wife and daughter on the side of Bathurst Street in broad daylight in front of multiple eyewitnesses.
Well, I mean, that's pretty scary.
Yeah, yeah.
And um, so to go back on what you're doing, Jacques, so you, as we mentioned in this interview and the one before that, you cover mainly what happens in Toronto. You
Mhm.
are going to be covering as well, at least partly the London trial, the
Yeah.
hockey players. So are you going to be also covering something else outside of Toronto?
Um, at this point, I don't think so. I mean, we'll see what comes up in the next year, but for now, my only case outside of Toronto is the Hockey Canada sexual assault trial in London.
Okay. And is there any piece that you're working on right now that we should know about? We like to know the scoops and what's
Um, Well, nothing really because I'm actually about to go on vacation. So I'm just tying up a few. I've got a few outstanding things happening at court next week that I'm going to go cover. Like the sentencing for the man who killed his ex-wife and
yeah.
daughter on Monday. But no, I mean nothing major at the moment because I'm about to leave on vacation. So,
Yeah.
but maybe but once I'm back, yes, I'm sure there'll be other things to tackle.
Well, before you leave and before you go on vacation, I just wanted to touch on one other subject, and that
Mhm.
is the subject of bail. So, what have you been seeing from a reporter perspective about bail? I mean, like there are for sure some few high-profile cases where bail was covered. So, what are you seeing right now in bail court?
Um, well, what I guess what I'm seeing more generally is that there seems to the criticism of bail has continued from certain politicians, and I think that the scapegoating of bail has continued because I think it goes back to what we were talking about earlier, which is whether or not someone is granted or denied bail, it doesn't help address the bigger problem of why they've allegedly committed a crime to begin
But
with, why anyone commits a crime. And so I don't know if I've seen anything significantly different in bail court. I think I've just seen more of the same commentary from certain politicians using bail as an easy target to say that this is why the justice system is broken, blah, blah, blah. But um, which is unfortunate because I just don't think politicians should be kind of actively undermining confidence in the justice system. And so I always find that unfortunate when I do see that criticism. Because I just don't think you can criticize bail without also at least offering solutions to ensure that less people are entering the criminal justice system to begin with.
right. No, that is a good point, and that's I think the frustration that we see in courts,
Mhm.
that we see that there are some problems, ongoing problems and issues, but it doesn't feel like any of them are really being addressed at the root or
Yeah,
the origin of what's causing these problems. And there seem to be something. I mean, like these random attacks, I mean, that's scary. And
yeah.
I'm sure there must be something to explain that, but it doesn't seem like for now there's an explanation.
They're very senseless. Yeah.
Scary. So, I mean, I don't know. Is the conclusion to all of that we should all stay at home maybe and go back to the COVID days? Be safer at home.
Yeah, I mean, like you've got to live your life at the end of the day. You've just always got to be cautious and aware of your surroundings. But I I'm optimistic. I think that we might be at least turning a page and that compared to those years right after the pandemic, I'm hopeful that things have changed for the better. But we'll know for sure, I think in
We'll
another two
see what
years
the
or
next
so.
trend will be. So there's
Yes.
always like a few years, like a
Yes.
few years back, it was sex assaults. They
Yeah.
were all the big cases.
Yeah.
Now they're not the hot new cases. Like now it seems like it's a different wave.
Mhm.
So I will be curious to hear back from you again, Jacques, to see what the new trend in crime sadly is.
Yeah, I don't know if the word happy is the right word, but I'll be very glad to talk to you about it when that time
Well,
comes.
I can't wait to talk to you again, and hopefully it won't be a very violent way. But
Yes. Oh, please. Yes, I'm hoping. Yeah. Yeah.
all right. Well, I want to wish you a wonderful vacation,
Thank you.
and I hope to see you soon again.
Thanks, you too. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jacques.